Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Graham for convening this hearing. There's limited time and a couple important questions I want to make sure to get in, so let me get right to it, and I'll ask responses to be under a minute if at all possible. Clearly, we've established today that farm workers play a critical role in ensuring our domestic food supply is both secure and sustainable. Farm workers, and I've seen this firsthand, work in jobs that are among the most dangerous, the most strenuous, and yet the least compensated in the country, and far too often with the fewest labor protections. As Mr. Litch stated in his testimony, food security is national security, and that could not have been clearer than what we all saw during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's one of the many reasons that the first bill I introduced in the Senate was my Citizenship for Essential Workers Act. My first question is for Mr. Costa. Agricultural workforce industry employs about 400,000 workers. Given the significant overrepresentation of undocumented immigrants in the industry, how could providing a pathway to legalization for farm workers bolster the U.S. economy and trade relations?
Well, it would bolster the economy by allowing immigrants to have rights in the workplace, labor and employment rights, and be able to better themselves, and their wages would rise, and they'd be able to pay taxes and have just the security of being able to go to work. And I would say it's actually 800,000 workers in California. 400,000 is full-time jobs, so it's a very large number of workers that need those protections.
Thank you. I'll just add to that they are paying taxes into programs that they're not eligible to benefit from. So it's a net benefit to the federal government and to the U.S. economy. Second topic, as temperatures continue to rise across the country, more and more workers, including farm workers, are at increased risk of heat illness, which can often lead to not just cramps, but organ damage, heat exhaustion, stroke, even death. In fact, according to a recent Public Citizen report, heat stress is expected to kill 2,000 workers and cause an additional 170,000 workplace injuries across the country. That's why I've introduced the Asunción Valdivia Heat Illness and Fatality Prevention Act. Ms. Torres, can you discuss what protections exist for farm workers currently that suffer from heat-related injuries, or what Congress can do to better support these protections?
Thank you, Senator. Well, for most farm workers, there remains no requirement that would provide access to shade for periodic breaks to be able to get a reprieve from the sun, something that basic. At the national level, there is no heat standard, and clearly the bill that you have introduced, Asunción Valdivia bill, would basically do what we have done in California, where farm workers do have access to be able to take paid breaks whenever they need them, when it is hot, so that they can get that reprieve, and the type of water and access to water that they would need. So these are all very important things, and so we certainly encourage having the Asunción Valdivia Act pass. California is only...
I was just going to add, and to be clear, we're not talking about shade and cool drinking water as a luxury or as a comfort.
Basic.
We're talking about basic protections in conditions that are on a very regular basis. In other parts of the country, but particularly the West, temperatures of 110, 120 degrees from sunrise to sunset. Extreme weather conditions. The last topic, if I can get to it quickly, deals with worker protections. Despite the grueling and dangerous work, farm workers themselves often struggle to feed their own families because of low wages. In fact, official data tells us 1/3 of farm workers live below the poverty line. I actually think the real number is bigger. Fewer than half have health insurance or paid sick leave of any kind. They do not qualify for unemployment insurance or other social safety net programs because of their undocumented status. And most farm workers do not have the right to collective bargaining. And without that, they can be retaliated against for organizing, for reporting unfair labor practices, or even complaining about working conditions. That's why I've introduced the Fairness for Farm Workers Act last Congress that would have guaranteed overtime. Simple concept, overtime pay and additional minimum wage protections for farm workers. Can you describe for a minute what some of the protections that have been gained in California and how they've helped workers?
Absolutely, Senator. Well, overtime pay, as you mentioned, is something that farm workers around the country don't usually get to experience. And so in California, we were able to pass an overtime law that allows for farm workers to be able to get overtime after 40 hours worth of work. Prior to that, workers could work up to 60 hours or more. That's 6 days a week, often working 10 or more hours a day. And so what time do they get to spend with their children? You have farm workers now who are able to spend that time with their kids. They are able to get overtime like any other worker after they work those 40 hours. So it makes a huge difference in the quality of their life. But in addition, for their paycheck, right? It makes a difference to be able to get paid for the very deserving, backbreaking work that they do.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I know my time is up, but I just can't help but to request a fact check. Earlier in the hearing, Senator Graham cited a statistic suggesting that 60 to 75% of our farm workforce are immigrants, and was surprised that it's not a higher figure. My understanding is that 60 to 75% figure refers specifically to undocumented immigrants. If we were to add lawful immigrants, visa holders, and otherwise, the figure would clearly be a lot higher, and I'd be surprised if the total figure isn't in the mid to high 90s. Senator Graham also implied that providing permanent protections for farm workers would serve as a magnet for migrants and lead to a surge at the border. Let's be real. Republicans said the same thing about the lifting of Title 42. And the surge did not happen. For members wanting to address irregular migration, we have to acknowledge that the pressures created for irregular migration are in large part driven by how hard we make it to come to this country lawfully. Whether it's the process, whether it's the backlogs, whether it's the caps. Mr. Chair, there was no surge when Title 42 was lifted. There will be no surge if we pass the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. There will be no surge if we pass the DREAM Act. To paraphrase Senator Graham once again, we can do a small deal, we can do a medium deal, we can do a big deal. But my God, let's get past the pretext, let's get past the excuses, let's get past the rhetoric, and let's do a deal that's good for growers, good for workers, good for consumers, and good for our national security. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.